winter count. And the Indians would make these. They notated the history of an individual and also used it to keep track of time. Indians didn't have, for example, they wouldn't say it was 1835. They'd say the winter of the big snows, for which would be an event where there was more snow than usual. Or the winter of the Crow attack, when the Crow attacked their village or whatever. Some monumentous event that made that year unique. This is actually the life story of a Mandan chieftain named Matotepi. The Mandan are, for all intent and purposes, extinct now. This hide, or this robe, was made in 1834, and there's 2 of them, and the other one's in the Smithsonian. But this notates his war adventures. He's the guy in blue. And it shows him fighting a Cheyenne and fighting with other tribes and getting wounded. And it tells basically his life history. Now, normally, in many cases, some of these robes would have had scalps on there with the banners, or with the various years. In this case, he uses horsehair, so it's a little different. Then, over here we have agate collection. Agates are found all over Montana, and people love to collect them and polish them, and they're really beautiful. The moss agates are really popular, and this would be a moss agate here. It looks like there's moss growing inside the rock. Careful. Okay, then we move over into our fossil section. This is Avaceratops lamercine. Ava is one of a kind. She's the only one that's ever been found. She's a young one. She probably would have been about the size of a rhino when fully grown. She's early Cretaceous, and you can tell, looking at her jaws, one of the things that makes her unique, she doesn't have any teeth. Grass didn't evolve until the late Cretaceous, so she was eating very woody plants and ferns, things like that. She didn't need teeth. She's got basically garden shears. Now, she was found just about 13 miles east of here, just outside of the town of Shawmut. It's kind of a funny story because you'll see over here we have a shoulder blade and a femur from a hadrosaur down on the bottom shelf there. When the paleontologists came and asked the Lammers Ranch if they could hunt fossils, they said sure. And then they asked, well, have you seen any fossils? And he says, yeah, there's some up on that trail there. The sheep have been tripping over them for years. Well, the paleontologist went up, got all excited, picked up those bones and started digging for the rest of the hadrosaur when they found Ava. And the hadrosaur got forgot. So all we've got is a little bit of their femur and a shoulder blade. But Eva, aside from being the only one ever found, in many ways she shows later characteristics that also mirror what was seen in the Triceratops, the bigger animals that we're more familiar with from Jurassic Park and other movies. We have a artist's rendition of what Ava probably would have looked like. It's all supposition because we have no idea. But anyway, she does at the back of her skull have the joint that is unique to the Triceratops. It's a ball joint at the end of their vertebrae so that their head could turn in pretty much any direction. And it's the only species ever that has that ball joint. an armored dinosaur, like an ankylosaur or a nodosaur. She didn't have spikes. She did have horns, but she didn't have spikes. But it's interesting to note that you look, and the way her bones are, all of her vitals are pretty much covered from an upward attack, or from an attack on the top. The ceratopsians also were unique in the fact that their front legs were bowed out like a reptile when they walked, but their rear legs were close together. So when they braced, they became a tripod, and they were nearly impossible to move. So they're a very unique species of animal. And I can also tell you that Triceratops eventually did evolve teeth, because I got some right there. And these are some other fossils that are found from this area. At one time, this was the bottom of the ocean. We have fossils in the snowy mountains that date back to the Devonian period. And down at the bottom there, we have matrix, which is how fossils, when they're found, are pulled out of the ground before they're moved to the lab for processing to pull the bones out of the material they're embedded in. Each of the red dots is a bone. And these are from a Tenodosaurus, which is another version of a duck-billed dinosaur. But you'll notice the ammonites and other that we've got here, because this was at the bottom of the sea at one time. And the reason the MusselShell River is named the MusselShell, when Lewis and Clark were coming up the Missouri, where the MusselShell empties into the Missouri, there were a lot of these fossilized mussel shells. And so it's called the MusselShell. Lewis and Clark named it. But we have gastroliths, and we have a lobster claw, we have petrified figs, coprolites, we have mammoth teeth, all sorts of stuff, petrified seashells. This area is very, very rich in fossil life. At one time, when Eva was here, was before the crazy mountains had even started to rise, with the Pacific plate going underneath the North American plate and forcing up the Rocky Mountains. So the inland sea that ran from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, the shoreline was actually between Rygate and Roundup, so about 35, 40 miles west of us here, or east of us. So this area here at that time would have looked a lot like the Okefenokee Swamp or the Everglades. Now over here, this is a cast of an Apatosaur that was found in Utah. Now the tooth is real, but the bone is a cast. This animal weighed about 54 tons. Fred Flintstone rode a Brontosaurus. Well, the Brontosaurus came about because there were, during the 1870s, the fossil cowboys were going around trying to find bigger and bigger and bigger fossils. And they were getting paid by museums in New York and Boston and Chicago, the natural history museums, for the next big find. So they were looking fast, and they were using dynamite to blast cliffs and everything else. Hard to say how many fossils they destroyed while they were looking. But what they did was they found the body of one type of sauropod and the skull of another and put them together, and it became the Brontosaurus that we saw in Fred Flintstone. In reality, when they matched the right bodies to the right heads, it became the Apatosaur.
Interesting. Yeah, leave it to a group of cowboys.
We have a Tenodosaur claw and vertebrae, and this is a vertebrae from or tibia from a hadrosaur and some others, and these are buffalo bones from this area that have been found. They probably date back at least 100 years, 150, 200 years. The southern herd was killed off in the 1860s and 70s, but the northern herd lived in this area, and the last bunch weren't killed off until the late 1880s, about 1888. There was a herd out at Winnicook, and a group of pendereel took them out. So, but they lasted a lot longer here than they did in other parts of the country. We also have a very nice mineral collection, courtesy of Don Amundsen, who's one of our directors. And he is a real rockhound. And he's got some very nice pieces there on exhibit. And anyone who wants to talk about rocks, he is the guy to talk to. He's fantastic to talk to.
Wow.
Okay, we have our carriages here. This is actually a Clarence Carriage. It was named after Prince William, the Duke of Clarence. He later became King William IV of the United Kingdom. He died in 1837. This was introduced roughly 1840 in England. This was luxury. This was the Mercedes-Benz of its day. As you can see, it has glass. The windows actually rise and close. The seats are padded, and it has leaf springs on all four wheels. Normally, like a stagecoach, would have two leather straps that run from the front axles to the back axles, and it gave it a seesaw motion, and people got seasick as all get out riding those things.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because they were just constant waving back and forth. These were not used outside of town. These were a luxury vehicle for going to your parties and soirees. You notice the footman and the driver were out here freezing their butt off, while the rich people were inside where it was nice and warm. We also have the Bernie Grinvall collection, Barney Grinvall. This is only part of the collection. This is a rotating part of the collection because he's had a huge collection of swords and knives.
Wow.
The saber there is Persian and was used at the Khyber Pass in a battle in about 1747. And it is original.
So what's the tooth-looking thing up here?
That's a Qatar. That's a push knife.
Okay.
Mostly used by the Sikhs. It was a special kind of weapon. The push knife was specifically designed to penetrate the woven armor that they had. You had a lot of force with a thrust, and being able to fit your hand up between there, grab the handle, it put the blade on the front, so you had a punch motion with it to penetrate armor. You could also slash with it, but because of the braces, it pretty much immobilized your wrist, so you did not have a lot of flexibility. But for pushing, you could penetrate armor, and that was the idea. We also have this is a 1880 Brazilian Cavalry Saber. It kind of threw me off and a couple other people, because on the end of the guard there it says EUB. And what the heck is an EUB? It is Estados Unidos Brazil. Finally figured that out. For someone who doesn't speak Spanish or Portuguese, it took a little bit. But we also have several original blades from different periods. The World War I model 1913 patent saber, or sword. You'll notice it's a straight sword as opposed to a saber with a curve. It was more for thrusting, but it was designed by our favorite George Patton of World War II. His father designed it.
Okay.
Now here we have the Thomas Sorbo collection. He was a photographer in the town here in the early 1900s, and he was he worked very hard taking pictures of the entire area and just daily life. And we have recreated up above here a little bit of his studio, including his camera. But he has made a visual history of Harlowton that we wouldn't have otherwise. And he took pictures of just average events, building a barn or building a house, or one of the buildings here in town, one of the businesses. Circus came to town. Some of our local upstanding city fathers. We've got a lot of images from him, and we have more in our digital archives, but he made so many it's hard to put them out.
Oh.
This wolf robe here was made in 1880, the last year that wolves were seen on the Winnicook Ranch down here. Now, wolves were a real problem for the stock growers in this area. They were everywhere. And there was full-scale war against the wolves. And the last big lobo was a big white wolf that was up at Stanford, and his pelt he was taxidermied in a full-body mountain, kept up there. He killed thousands of animals. He would go through a flock of sheep and just kill. He would go through a herd of cattle and just rip them to shreds. Not to eat, just to kill. And he had every wolfer and cowboy and settler in the country after him because it was a very large reward on his head. And he lasted for multiple years. It was more by accident that he was taken than anything else, but he was finally taken. But anyway, this wolf robe was from 1880, about that time period. We have our doctor's buggy. If anyone's watched Gunsmoke, they see Doc Adams going out to the farms. That's a buggy just exactly like the one that's on the show. And you'll notice this is a luxury model because it has leaf springs at the front and back, so it rode a lot nicer. A lot of spring wagons and that would have a spring just on the seat, not on the body of the wagon, and it would beat you
like
to
the old
pieces,
buckboards.
like the old buckboards. Yeah. Here we have a good assortment of instruments that were used in this area, from the old button accordion